Alright guys, so today we're going to take a look at tying the CDC Loopwing Midge emerger. And this is just imitating that transitional stage between the Midge pupa and the adult, which is really key for fly fishermen as trout really tend to key in on this transitional stage as these insects are struggling to emerge. So to tie this, we're just using a size 16 scud hook. And what I really like about this pattern in particular is we can tie down really small with these materials. So this emerger pattern is really kind of generic. We can do a lot with it. And to tie this, we're going to use A-dot uni thread. But because we can tie this so small as you get down to the, size 20, 22, you might want to move to a smaller tying thread. And I've really gotten to love this Vivus tying thread for those small flies. But anyway, we're just going to look at the simplest forms of these patterns. Start our tying thread on here. And then we might change it up on the second one and, do things a little differently. But the key materials here are definitely goose biot, tying thread obviously, and then some dubbing. In this particular case, we're going to use some microfine dubbing. And then CDC feathers also are an important part and really the key to making this a merger. So our first step is we're just going to tie our tying thread and wind it back to the bend of the hook. And I tend to take it a little bit down the bend, not too much. And then we tie in our goose biot. So goose biot is a really cool material because depending on how you tie it in, you're going to get different ribbing. In this case, you can see the notch. If the notch is facing up or away from you, you're going to get a really smooth pattern on your abdomen. If you tie it with the notch facing down or towards you, you're going to get a more ribbed appearance that are really good for a lot of different nymphs. So we're going to tie this in with the notch facing up. And I'm actually going to wrap this first to show you what it can look like if you don't do really tight wraps with this goose biot. And again, we're working for a really smooth abdomen right here. And this is also an important reason why you should, pull your biots off the stem rather than cut them. And so you can see that notch and see how you're cutting it. So in this case, I'm not really tying tight wraps. And I'm not wrapping over the leading edge of the previous wrap. And you can see that it's kind of this uneven, kind of fuzzy appearance, which is not what we're going for. And if you do that, I don't think it's going to make you not catch fish. But just as a tyer, sometimes I like them to look pretty good. So now we're going to go much tighter wraps. Make sure we cover that leading edge. And you can see on the body that it's much smoother. And with black, it's hard to see kind of the ribbing. But if you use a different colored biot, you can actually kind of see that there's still segmentation when you wrap this way. So now I just wrap around the biot, almost like when you're forming a stem for a parachute. And this just makes it so when I clip it off, my previous couple of wraps don't loosen up. So clip that, tie it down. And now we're going to add the CDC feather. And for this size hook, you could probably add just some feathers. But where I usually tie these smaller, I will actually trim the barbs off the stem of the CDC and work with it that way. And it really lets me kind of determine how much CDC I'm putting on there. And for these flies, I don't want a whole lot. I actually missed a couple fibers, but that's all right. I like it a little skimpy, and it's because I really like these flies struggling to stay in the surface film. And if you want them to ride a little higher in the surface film, you just add more CDC. And you could also add some hackle in if you want. So now I'm just doing a direct dubbing. Don't want a lot. We like to keep everything slim, low profile for midges. And where this doesn't rod really high, and especially if you tie them small, it can make these flies pretty tough to fish on their own. Uh, I usually like to fish them in tandem with a larger, more visible dry fly, and that just lets me know, where this fly's at in the water. Let's make a nice even thorax. And to make the loopwing, I'm just pulling that CDC over, and then I'm kind of pushing back on it against the eye with my fingers and doing one loose wrap. And you can see that loop. And I like to make sure, it's sitting on top of the fly properly. And then I'll do a couple more tighter wraps to secure it. And you might get some fibers coming off the back, and that's fine. I actually like that. But you should be able to put your bodkin or other needle through that loop. And a lot of guys will actually tie it that way and use a needle and pull the CDC fibers over that. So now we've got this loose CDC coming off the eye hook, and we have a couple options. We can clip it, make it a little stem, or in this case, I'm actually going to tie it back. So it's hard to tell from this angle, but I'm just kind of dividing these fibers up as evenly as I can. And then I'm just going to tie them back. Because as these bugs are emerging, they've got a lot, the wing cases, legs, all that's kind of coming out of this casing. It's really buggy, and CDC has really good movement in the water. And pulling them back this way, I just think gives this fly a lot of life. So tie them back, form our little head. Whip finish. And after I cut this thread, I'm going to go in and kind of trim these CDC fibers that I pulled back. I like them to stay a little bit shorter than the hook's gap width. And CDC is soft enough. I don't think it's going to keep you from, setting the hook, but it's probably more how I like how it looks and just habit of doing it with other flies. But that's the CDC Loopwing emerger. Now, you can also add, a shuck or trailing material come off the end. And actually, I think we might try that on this next pattern. But it's a little more detailed than some other flies that we'll look at. But it's still easy to tie. It's still effective. But again, it can be tough trying to fish on its own, especially if you're not in very calm waters. You really need that leading fly to be a little more visible to allow you to understand where it's at in the water. So we're going to do another one here. We're going to stay with the black thread. I don't feel like changing it. And we're going to use some antron. If I can get some. And we're going to use that as our shuck material. And you don't need a whole lot. When I clip some off, I usually, for this size 16, I'll only add half of what I clip. And we want to do, somewhere around shank length coming off the bend. We'll just wrap that from the eye back to help us keep a even body for the rest of the fly. Trim off this. And now we're going to add in our goose biot. But this is one of my favorite midge emerging patterns. I just think it does such a good job at imitating the natural, especially with that loop wing. CDC has a really cool property of those fibers coming off the stem actually trap little and form little gas bubbles on those fibers. And when the naturals emerge, you'll also see kind of these gas bubbles that are being trapped around the thorax. And CDC is one of the best, if not the best, at imitating that phenomenon. Wrap our CDC. And with emergers, they're not sitting high and dry. They're really struggling to get through that surface film. And that's why I like, being really conservative with the amount of CDC I'm using. I mean, I want this fly to struggle to stay up, which is great at imitating naturals. And again, it makes it a little tougher to fish from a visual standpoint, at least. We got that. Now we're going to tie in our CDC, get these fibers. And we're going to go with some tan CDC this time instead of the darker dun. And again, stripping the fibers just works better for me when I'm dealing with a size, 20 fly than trying to work with a feather, full feather. Do a little direct dubbing, form that thorax. Excuse me. Form that. And again, I think it's really important to use as few materials as you can with midges. I mean, if you've seen them on the river, I mean, there's nothing to them. You don't want bulk. Form this loop. And then tie up under that stem, just take the pressure off. So that looks good. And I think this time we're not going to pull back these CDC fibers. We're just going to make a little post coming off. And this stem is going to make the fly sit a little differently in the water than it would if you tied these back. It will sit a little more vertical, but that's also going to depend on the amount of CDC that you're using, as well as the length of the stem, or post, I guess is a better word for it. Where we're doing this with not a whole lot of CDC, it's not going to be too drastic of a difference. And then you can always cut it down or trim it down a little more if you don't want it to sit very vertical at all, but still want kind of that presentation of the natural where they've got, antennas and legs kind of sticking out the front where they're emerging. So we'll whip finish this, finish this fly off. But yeah, this is just another kind of small variation to that original pattern. And there's a lot you can do with it. And I do want to say, when I start tying these, down to 20 and sometimes 22, I'll take the goose biot out, which is a little harder to work with those small patterns. And I'll actually just use tying thread. And that makes it a little more simpler and kind of cuts down on the bulkiness. I'm actually going to trim this down a bit more. So yeah, around this level, you're not going to have this fly sitting vertical at all. But that's the CDC Loopwing Emerger. It's a great pattern to imitate the naturals. I hope you check out. We're going to have another emerger pattern to show y'all, and then we're going to put out some adult patterns as well.